This week, we want to begin our look at Unit 2 material. This material will cover the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the cranial nerves. So this week, though, we are going to focus on the brainstem. You will remember from our first day of class that the brainstem was made up of three areas: the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. From there, since the cerebellum attaches to the brainstem, we will look at the cerebellum next week, and then we will add the cranial nerves, where most of them will also emerge from the brainstem. When we talk about the brainstem, and it is regardless of whether we're talking about the medulla, pons, or midbrain, we can always, first of all, identify some area associated with the ventricular system of the brain. Depending on where we are in the brainstem, that could be the fourth ventricle, that could be the cerebral aqueduct. Then what we can do is we can take the brainstem and we can divide it into three parts. So that if this is dorsal on this cross section and this is ventral on this cross section, we can take the lower 1/3, and the lower 1/3 is going to be the basilar portion of the brainstem. For the most part, and again, this is a very, very general rule, the basilar portion is where we're going to see the motor systems associated with the brainstem. Then we can take this dorsal or upper 1/3, and we can refer to that as the tectum. The tectum, again, as kind of just a general statement, is going to be that part which is going to be associated with the sensory components of the brainstem. And then finally, in the middle, we are going to have a tegmentum. And the tegmentum is going to be more or less kind of a mixture of structures, sensory and motor. So, as we work through this and we look at various cross sections, we are going to be referring to the basilar portion, the tectum, tegmentum, etc. But this is really only for bookkeeping. We are never going to get involved in asking specific questions about specific structures and where they belong. One author suggested that the brainstem was really like the spinal cord to the head, in that we're going to see spinal nerves distributing to the muscles of the body. Well, we can have cranial nerves that are going to be distributing to the head. And so we're going to see motor neurons. We're going to see general sensory neurons that are going to be coming out of the brainstem and then distributing to various head structures. But also the brainstem is going to be just for tract conduction. Say we have a sensory tract coming from the spinal cord and going to the thalamus. Well, it's going to have to pass through the brainstem. One of the structures that we are going to talk about a little bit later on in this unit is a structure called the reticular formation. And we're going to see that the reticular formation is very, very important in our conscious state. And then finally, we know that heart rate and respiratory rates are going to be controlled or sensed in the brainstem. So what I want to do now is to begin with the medulla and just work my way up through the pons and finally ending in the midbrain. And the way that I'm going to present this is we're going to look at external anatomy first, and then we are going to look at a series of cross sections so that we can see the internal anatomy. The hardest part about this unit as a student is, based on these images, we are going to have to put together a three-dimensional picture of each one of these areas. As we begin talking about the medulla, the first thing that I would like to do is just define it. And so we can look at the upper boundary of the medulla as an indentation, which is called the pontomedullary junction. And the pontomedullary junction is a very, very sharp indentation that creates this borderline. Then for a lower boundary, you'll remember when we talked about the spinal cord, we said that we could use the pyramidal decussations, which is where the motor systems are going to cross the midline. We could also use as a skeletal boundary the foramen magnum. And we said that if the structure was inside the skull, it was medulla. If it was outside the skull, it was spinal cord. But we can also use as a very precise boundary where the C1 nerve rootlets are found. Because of the concept of the spinal cord neurotome, we can then use the C1 nerve as a very distinct boundary. The medulla will be found in the posterior cranial fossa of the skull. So first, I want to look at a ventral view of the external anatomy of the medulla. So what we're going to do first of all is I'm going to show the pontomedullary junction as that upper boundary of the medulla going into the pons. Next, I want to identify a structure that cuts right down the middle. And that structure is called the ventral median fissure. The ventral median fissure is continuous with the ventral median fissure of the spinal cord. It's just going to ascend up through the medulla and finally end at the pontomedullary junction. On either side of the ventral median fissure, where the blue dots are, we are going to have structures which are called the pyramids. The pyramids are made up of a motor tract called the cortico-spinal tract. And this tract is the major voluntary motor tract of the body. And so what we're going to see is coming down through the pyramids, we're going to see the two cortical spinal tracts, one on each side. And then at the decussation, we're going to see approximately 80% of the fibers crossing the midline and forming the lateral cortical spinal tract of the spinal cord. And again, that's going to make up about 80% of the fibers. Numbers do vary from author to author. The other approximately 20% of the fibers are going to stay on the same side. And these fibers are going to form the anterior cortical spinal tract. So when we see these two tracts in the spinal cord, we can now look at where did they come from. Then just lateral to the pyramids, we are going to see two raised areas. And these two raised areas, shown in purple, are going to be the olives. Now, the olives are going to have a series of names depending on the author. You may see them as the olivary complex. You may see them as the inferior olives. You may see them just as the olive. Again, pick a term. It really doesn't matter. But the olives are associated with motor system control. Okay, motor system control. Then, in between the pyramid and the olive, there is an indentation. And that indentation is called the pre-olivary sulcus. And then behind the olive, and it's hard to see on this picture, but right back here, we would see a post-olivary sulcus. So therefore, if you're going to name structures as you move across this ventral surface, you would see, first of all, the ventral median fissure. Then you would see the pyramid. Then you would see the pre-olivary sulcus. Then you would see the olive. Then you would see the post-olivary sulcus. Well, these two sulci, pre-olivary and post-olivary, are actually going to come up from the spinal cord. So if we look at this side picture right here, we're going to see coming up from the spinal cord an indentation called the anterior lateral sulcus. Anterior lateral sulcus is where the ventral roots are going to emerge from the spinal cord. But then this sulcus is going to come up and meet with the olive, and it has to do something. So what it's going to do is it's going to continue as the pre-olivary sulcus. So we can say that the pre-olivary sulcus is a continuation of the anterior lateral sulcus. The post-olivary sulcus is a brand new indentation associated with the medulla, and it doesn't continue from anything. The importance of these sulci are not necessarily just that they are depressions. It is the fact that out of the post-olivary sulcus, we're going to see cranial nerves 9, cranial nerve 10, and cranial nerve 11 emerging. Out of the pre-olivary sulcus, we're going to see cranial nerve 12 emerge. So yes, they are anatomical indentations, but this is how we are going to identify the various cranial nerves associated with the medulla.